Hi, and welcome to Module 6, which is all about the movement of energy. Our open-ended thinking question, and I just realized looking at this that it sort of gets it away, is looking at these different forest ecosystems. You can notice that there's obviously an artificial fence with two very distinct types of forests. I want you to think about these questions before we get into Module 6. What process is causing these forests to look so different? How will these forest areas change over time between the fenced and unfenced enclosures? And which areas do you think are more productive? What is productivity? Which areas are more biodiverse? Which ecosystems would we consider more healthy? To help us understand this, today we're going to be learning these key concepts: the role of photosynthesis and respiration within an ecosystem and its productivity, and the roles of transfer efficiency to food webs and trophic pyramids, thinking about how energy and how it's transferred sort of sets up the stage for diverse, productive, resilient ecosystems to exist. Here are our thinking questions for the day. How does productivity influence biomass? Why is it important to conserve productive ecosystems for both natural and human success? And why are bacteria and plants more important than the majestic lion within the ecosystem? Now, to start us off, we're going to talk about ecosystem boundaries. Now, an ecosystem is just an area of space that has some level of shared abiotic and biotic characteristics. They can be very small. That means that they're quite uniform and extremely specific to the characteristics. Or they can be broader macro ecosystems that have shades of similarity. They're not completely identical. Now, organisms have really specific ecosystems that they thrive in or move throughout to maximize their benefit, their survival, and the specific biotic and abiotic needs that fulfill their survival and ability to survive and reproduce. Now, paramount to this is energy availability. So we can see right here a range map of both summer and winter homes for elk within the greater Jackson, Wyoming ecosystem. And that you can see that elk have very specific winter and summer ranges based on the territory, the ecosystems, the availability of resources, the temperature, and that it's very, very different between winter and summer. Now, additionally, you can learn more about how grizzly bear conservation in the Greater Yellowstone National Park was necessary due to all of the grizzly bears leaving the park perimeters and being shot. So this is a recent case ruling in favor of grizzly bears. Now, what makes an ecosystem? The first thing that we need to know is that energy reactions are super important for determining the type of ecosystem that we find and the relative health and plethora of species we find within it. Autotrophic, meaning self-produced energy, photosynthetic organisms are really important. They convert CO2 into glucose. We call that photosynthesis. Now, higher areas of photosynthesis means that there's more biomass. More biomass means that there's more organisms, and more organisms means that there's generally more biodiversity. So we can see higher rates of photosynthesis in up regions of upwelling or coastal regions in the ocean, and also regions near the equator in terrestrial ecosystems that get a lot of sunlight and a lot of rainfall, and regions that don't necessarily get to it. Now, this is important because consumers either eat producers, plants, or lower consumers, an eagle eats a squirrel, to obtain chemical energy, but the process is pretty inefficient, which means the more energy there is, the more species we can have, the more organisms, the more biodiverse. So conserving productive places is really important. George Bush, in the last days of his administration, created this huge coastal reef reserve, which is roughly the size of the western United States. And it's a really productive biodiverse area of aquatic ecosystems. We find these regions of upwelling throughout the world with huge amounts of biomass and productivity, which support both natural processes and a lot of local fisheries. Now, food webs are really important to capture how different ecosystems have interactions between species and abiotic factors. Food webs just arrange species into interactions based on their location, their trophic level, do they make food, or are they eating other things to get their energy, and their ecosystem roles. Generally, we go from producers to consumers to secondary consumers, and when they all die, they're recycled by detrivores. So in this image right here, it's sort of a food web slash ecological study of how deer influence the vegetation patterns and forest succession of trees. Now in these images I showed you earlier, this is the result of deer grazing. So a forest without deer or the properly managed deer population would have a robust understory with lots of young saplings and ferns, and in the presence of deer, we really don't have a lot. Now that's going to influence the types of vegetation that we find, which will influence soil properties given root characteristics, but it's also going to influence insects and birds and small animals based on their habitats and what they need to survive, as well as things like fruit and seed production or the diversity of plant communities in terms of being able to harvest trees for timber or maple syrup or other products. Now, equally important above ground is the underground properties of soil formation. So all of the detrivores and bacteria that are within an ecosystem really make sure that nutrients and matter are recycled so we can have healthy primary producers and healthy consumers and a healthy ecosystem. Now, primary productivity is sort of your take-home paycheck. We measure how much money an ecosystem has based on the amount of solar energy that's captured by plants. This is the bottom of the food chain. This really determines what other organisms can do and how successful they are. Now there's gross primary productivity and net primary productivity. About 1% of all solar energy that strikes a plant can be captured and used to create glucose. About 60% of that, though, is going to be lost to respiration, which is a lot higher than most people's tax brackets. About 40%, so 0.4% of all solar energy is going to be captured and used to create new biomass. Now, each ecosystem, based on its location, the soil characteristics, the temperature profile, have different levels of productivity. Just like different people have different types of paychecks based on the job demands, the job stresses, and the job requirements. So different parts of the world occupy different places, yet have very disparaging differences within their primary productivity. So open ocean and continental shelves make up a huge part of the world, yet they barely produce anything. But things like the tropical rainforest, tropical seasonal forests, or even lakes, streams, marshes, and algal reefs are all really productive. So we can use those two things to really think about where is the primary productivity happening. The open ocean barely has any productivity per meter, yet because it's so big, it is responsible for a huge part of the world's open ocean, got tongue-tied, a huge part of the Earth's primary productivity. If you want to learn more about why salt marshes are so cool, here's a good link here. So energy interactions. We have net primary productivity, our take-home pay. How much glucose does an ecosystem have? That determines really the standing crop or the amount of biomass that we can have within an ecosystem at any given time. So 1,000 joules of energy, $1,000 hits grass, we're only going to be about $10 or 10 joules of energy available in this food. Of those 10 joules of energy captured in the grass, only 1 joule of energy is going to be transferred to a deer. So we call this the 10% rule. For each trophic interaction, plant to consumer to secondary consumer, only 10% of the energy, or you can think of it also as biomass, is converted to the next level successfully. The rest is lost as heat. So if we have 1,000 kilograms of grass, we can have 100 kilograms of herbivores, 10 kilograms of maybe a carnivore, and only 1 kilogram of a top dog, a top carnivore, a tertiary consumer. Which means that while we focus a lot of our conservation efforts on maybe protecting polar bears or lions, the underlying issues of an ecosystem and its primary productivity are far more important to making sure that the ecosystem is sustainable and that these large charismatic animals are okay. There's a good link right here about why polar bears are starving, which really has to do with not only changes in the food web, all of these being affected by warming ocean currents, but the melting of the sea ice, which prevents usable habitat for the polar bears to be able to eat ringed seals. So there's both chemical and biotic interactions changing the food web of a polar bear. Furthermore, for us thinking about our daily lives, this trophic interaction is really important to thinking about how beef has a far larger ecological impact than something like tomatoes, nuts, or peas and bananas. They have much smaller ecosystem impacts due to the fact that they are producers and not consumers. So if you want to learn more about the environmental impacts of food, this is a great link to take you to Our World in Data, which might be a useful resource for you. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed that module. Let me know what questions you have, and take care.